Hello and welcome back into Kerbal Space Program. Now, last time we had spent all of our science on all of this epic research, and we have lots of parts now. And because we unlocked this right here, the science tech, which gives us the survey scanner, so we can actually start scanning for ore, I kind of want to start putting some satellites around both the moon and Minmus to scan for some ore. But at the same time, because we still have 1500 science, what I kind of want to do is, since this costs 550 and we're sitting on about 1500, we can get 3 of the next tier science experiments. And one of them that I want is actually this one, the advanced science tech, because that gives us access to the drill and the ISRU converter, so we can basically mine ore infinitely from the planets, and then pull out and convert resources from, of course, the ore into liquid fuel and oxidizer, which is something I would very much want to do. And that's pretty much the main science that I want to grab, the main scientific experiment. But in order to do that, we need to actually upgrade the R&D center. Now, we've been focusing a lot on science, so we haven't focused too much on contracts recently, which means we haven't really gone past about 1 million funds. And this costs 1.7 million funds to upgrade. So, I was looking through all of the different contracts that I have available, and of course the only active one we have is this temperature scan, which I'll get to eventually, I guess. And Fly by the Sun, which shouldn't be too difficult if we use a probe, and we could possibly also use a real Kerbal. I'm considering that, but I think I'll just use a probe for this. But this one's going to be worth almost 300,000 by itself. So we're going to grab that one. We could always go back to the moon and grab plant a flag, because that is worth also a pretty significant amount of funds. Position a satellite in a specific orbit. Of course, there's a lot of satellite positionings. Now, of course, Explore Duna and Explore Ike are two that we would really like to do. However, actually, we most definitely are capable of, at our research level, to go to Duna and go to Ike. But we'll do that once we send this probe out to the moon, I guess. We might actually get to these next episode, I'm thinking, maybe, because I want to actually take care of this stuff. So, let's go to the sun. Now, we just have to fly by the sun, which means we probably don't need to go too low around it, although I suppose we could. We're just going to use a probe, though, because a probe will make it so we don't actually have to rescue a Kerbal. At least not yet. So, because I've been actually just going through this quickly, I'm actually going to sit here and build an actual probe, versus what I've been doing recently was not actually sticking in the VAB. I've been just kind of building these off camera and then launching them, but we're actually going to stick here. Now, the thing that's nice to note about the probes is that you can really just stick a few of these fuel tanks and get a huge amount of delta V. So, this is capable of getting into orbit. Just as is. This thing is capable of getting into orbit. Now, aside from this not having any it doesn't have a generator, meaning electric charge would run out in this vessel. This little tiny rocket, if we wanted to, it actually has enough delta V to get to orbit, I believe, since even in atmospheric mode it would have enough. Yeah, 3.8 thousand delta V. 3.8 thousand, 3.8k delta V. 3,800. Anyway, this little tiny probe is capable of getting to orbit. However, we're not going to make it to get to orbit on its own. So if it's got 4,300 with 4 tanks, how much does 3 tanks? So the 4th tank is about 300 delta V. You know, I'm just going to keep all of these. So we're going to stick all of these on. And we need, of course, power generation for this little probe that's going to go out around the sun. So, of course, we'll grab some solar panels. Since it's a very small probe, 2 small solar panels should do, and we'll even grab this little tiny battery and stick it up there, just that, of course, this thing can hold some charge Now it's going to be orbiting the sun, so there shouldn't really be any time that it's not facing the sun. Which actually, unless it goes behind a planet, or actually there's no point in bringing a battery, just kind of wasted mass. Even though it's virtually no mass, it's still really not necessary. Maybe for the launch stage though, so I guess I'll bring one anyway. Just because if this thing accidentally runs out of power before we have a chance to deploy our solar panels, then we'll never be able to deploy the solar panels. So along with this, I'm only going to bring a couple small experiments. I'm going to bring a thermometer, the barometer, and I think that's actually all the minor experiments I have, since I can't actually do a seismometer scan. And we'll just stick that kind of antenna there. That way we have two little experiments we can do. We're not going to get a lot of science from it, but at least we'll have something to do for our trip. With the probe core completed, the rest of the construction just really consists of deciding what we want our launch stage to look like and trying to actually work one of these new fairings, because it appears as though it got stuck on the solar panels as if they were of side of the craft. So what I did is I just got rid of the adapter piece and built a more straight fairing rather than kind of work around it. Now, in selecting the engine I wanted to go with one that's efficient but also provides lots of thrust, so I can use a drop tank method. And the thing about drop tanks is they add delta V without adding the mass of another engine. So if you actually look at how it works, if you don't add the mass of an additional engine, then when you add more fuel to the single engine that you have, then you are adding more delta V. But if you put an engine below those fuel tanks, then you actually are adding more mass and you're losing delta V on that. Although dropping them will be more efficient because you'll drop both the tank and the engine. But using drop tanks is more efficient in a way because you don't actually have to go with the next engine. Or go with the additional mass of another engine, I should say. As far as this, it's a pretty standard launch. I just put SRBs on the bottom so that, well, I can have that kicker stage, because this thing had a 1.04 thrust to weight ratio at sea level, and because of that, it basically allowed me to hover I'll say it 3 times for luck maybe. It allowed me to hover over the surface, which isn't enough to actually take off, so by adding the SRBs I kind of create a kicker stage that gets me a little bit higher up to where this engine can actually have a better thrust to weight ratio as well as better fuel efficiency. Since of course that was at sea level, but a little bit higher up it's better. So we drop the drop tanks and we begin to get into orbit. Now because we're aiming for a solar orbit, all we really have to do is escape, meaning we can just kind of keep burning away from Kerbal without having to really slow down. Now, if you are going to a specific planet, sometimes it's best to wait for a certain location, but actually we're kind of in an ideal spot. If you look at where we are, we're currently on the inside of Kerbal, which means if we keep burning the direction we are, then we will burn away from the sun, or we'll start slowing down to the sun, because Kerbal rotates anti-clockwise to the sun. So by, of course, burning in this direction constantly, which is the one we're heading for, then we will eventually escape. So let's throw away that fairing, which just kind of really quickly exploded, and go into our final probe stage, where we are going to now extend our panels. And go back to burning prograde. Now of course, to escape Kerbal you have to make it so your apoapsis goes well above minmus in order to actually get out of the gravity of Kerbal, because minmus is stuck in the gravity of Kerbal. So to escape the gravity of Kerbal you need to go past it. And there we are, we have gone past it. And now we're just going to keep burning in this direction because I know it's going to slow us down. So as long as our periapsis is on the opposite side of the sun as us, that means we're slowing down pretty efficiently. Now, I'm not sure how low we actually have to get to consider ourselves fly by the sun. We probably have to go much lower than we currently are, so we'll just keep burning until that happens. But little did I realize I actually only needed to change my sphere of influence to actually get fly by the sun, so the moment I escape Kerbin, all will be well. Anyhow, I still do put my periapsis pretty low so that maybe I can get the flyby close to the sun on my barometer and temperature scans, as to collect the most science I can out of this little probe before, of course, we actually send Kerbals to do a real mission of a solar flyby. That's rather strange. I don't have control of this vessel. Oh, maybe the probe core doesn't have any RCS control, because I can see the gimbal of the engine moving. However, I don't actually have any control over this thing. Oh well, I still have the ability to do the scans. And of course, we're just going to send this data back. Even though it's only at 50%, it's easier than actually recovering it. Although we probably will send Kerbals out to a mission like this sometime in the future. But for now, we'll just transmit our data. And that will be fine. There we go, we completed that contract. Let's go back to the Space Center to see what else we can get, so we can get some more funding, so that we can eventually upgrade our research and development center. Now I'm here in the mission control, and I noticed this contract about positioning a satellite in a specific orbit around the moon. And I thought, I'm going to take this one. And the reason I want to take this one is because this would be a good chance to kind of demonstrate being able to move into sort of a rendezvous from Kerbin's orbit into the moon's orbit. Meaning we go from Kerbin's orbit into the moon's orbit exactly how we want to. So in order to do this, we need to create a new unmanned probe with certain specifications, such as thermometer and a materials bay. Well, that shouldn't be too hard. Let's grab the one with the better reaction wheels and the SAS, so that we have at least some control of this thing. And just because I know we're going to need them, let's put some solar panels out and put a small battery down. That way we can accommodate, of course, power that we are going to be needing, and so we don't accidentally run out during launch or something. Now we do need a materials bay, so even this thing, though this thing is not called materials bay, I believe this is what we actually need, so we'll grab that. Since I'm not sure what it means by materials bay, but for some reason this part comes to mind, so I'll grab the Science Junior. And I believe this is all the probe did need a thermometer as well, so we'll stick one of those on. And this is all the probe needs, other than of course getting in orbit. So it does need an antenna. Probe has an antenna and can generate power. That's the very first specification, so we'll put a communitron on there, just because that'll fit on nicely. There, this is the probe we need. Now we're actually going to stick some fuel on it, and I'm thinking that a small fuel tank and a very small engine should do just fine. So, looking at this with Kerbal Engineer right now, we can see that with this super tiny fuel tank and this little tiny engine, we have 1800 delta V. Now, out of curiosity, if we put the bigger engine on, we actually lose almost 500 delta V just because of the mass difference in the engines. Even though I believe the Terrier engine is more fuel efficient, 345 versus 300. Yes, so the Terrier engine is more fuel efficient, however, it also weighs 5 times as much. So by using the smaller engine, we actually save a lot of delta V. Now, of course, the small engine doesn't really fit onto this stack very well. Maybe I can do something about that. Nah, I think I'll just leave it with this. We'll put the small engine down, and then we're going to grab some decouplers. Actually, I'll grab the 1.25 meter decoupler, even though it's larger than it needs to be, just because now I can actually attach some struts for stabilization. I'll just stick 2 of them on and attach them directly to the decoupler. That'll basically make it so that this gap here doesn't really bother us too much. So we have the top probe stage. And did those struts really add that much mass? Wow, that's incredible. The struts all by themselves took away 200 delta V. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to strut from the decoupler, meaning that the strut's base node is where the strut's mass is applied. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, is the fact where the struts are attached is where their mass is. So if you attach all your struts to your center core stage, you're actually going to keep all the mass even after you decouple them, because the node will stay. But if you attach them on the parts you're dropping, you'll actually save some delta V. But we have 1800 in this stage. We probably want a kicker stage to get us to the moon. So probably if we grab this fuel tank and now the Terrier engine, this will give us, wow, 2000 delta V for that? That's enough to finish our orbit and kick us into the moon. So I suppose that'll work. And we're going to keep this nice and staged. So now we just need basically the stage that gets us into orbit. And for that we're probably going to use 2.5 meter parts. So we'll grab an adapter, and I bet if I just use the orange fuel tank and the skipper engine, that would be enough. Let's see, skipper. And the skipper engine by itself can get us to orbit, so this thing is clearly overbuilt, but it'll work. And I think we probably want a fairing, so we'll stick one of those on as well. Now, deciding whether or not you need a fairing for a craft is basically depends on what the top of your craft looks like. So because this thing has a decent thrust to weight ratio, but since this craft has a decent thrust to weight ratio, for the bottom stage, it's probably a good idea to stick a fairing on because of those exposed solar panels. Even though I honestly don't think it would be too much of a problem, but I mean, it is going to help. Usually if you have something a little less aerodynamic, such as, because we're using a fairing, we can probably stick the thermometer there and actually remove this adapter, because the adapter kind of helps with aerodynamic drag, but since we are building against the aerodynamics, we can probably stick that there and even rotate these so they're not in the way. And there, we actually saved on a little mass, which kicks us up about another 100 delta V on our very top stage. Now, if you control it right, when you're in orbit around Kerbin, you can actually rendezvous directly onto the moon. Now, equatorial orbit is the easiest to do this with, but you can also do it with polar orbits and pretty much any other orbit that you really need to do it with. But we're gonna, because we're moving kind of slow, we're actually gonna tilt this early. But the benefit of being able to actually move to the moon directly from Kerbin is the fact that you can save yourself a lot of delta V of having to first get into orbit and then changing the orbit. Because while you're further away from the moon, a little amount of delta V can change your moon's orbit significantly, which means that you have much greater efficiency if you try to align your orbit when you're far away from the moon than when you're actually orbiting the moon. Okay, so to start actually explaining how you kind of rendezvous to a targeted orbit in a different sphere of influence, let's first double click on the moon so that we focus our view. Now, the first thing we want to note is basically the direction that the orbit that we're targeting is. If you look, you might be able to see that there are these lines that are making this orbit say it is clockwise, meaning that we want to enter here clockwise. Now, ahead of time, I already set up this encounter, and what this encounter does is if you look at it, you can see that this is where we exit the moon, meaning that we enter the moon over here, meaning our path has us travel in this direction. So if we were at periapsis and we were to slow down on our path, what this would do, if I actually decide to be partially intelligent, what would happen is if we slow down at periapsis, this would curl in, and this would basically be the direction that we're traveling. And of course, we could actually pull ourselves into the orbit with this. And yes, my drawing is atrocious, but it's better than me just swirling the mouse around trying to give you guys an image on what's going on. But, so this is the direction of the orbit we actually want. So if we click on our maneuver node, and I'm going to zoom out so that we have a little bit better control of the maneuver node, and we start slowing it down, you'll notice that the periapsis is converging. Now, it might not always be that slowing down will do this, but of course you can play around with the maneuver node until you actually get something like this to happen. And now what you'll notice is that our periapsis actually touches the orbit that we want to get into. And where the periapsis touches the orbit we want to get into, what we can actually do is create a maneuver node there to, of course, finish circularizing this orbit. So to do this, we have, basically this is step one. What we want to do is we want to set up our encounter, and we want to make it so that our flyby periapsis touches the orbit somewhere. And as long as our orbital direction is moving in the correct path, then this should work. So let's actually do this burn to finish step one, and we'll go to step two. Now, this thing has virtually no delta V left. We can actually use it once we get closer. We'll use it up, and then we'll kind of put it in an obscure orbit. At least then it won't be in a perfectly flat orbit. Or we might actually use it up trying to turn to face our maneuver node. Since this thing doesn't have enough torque to actually turn all of its mass, I need to use the engine's gimbal to do so. So we'll actually turn this up so you guys can see this thing. Now this orange tank was surprisingly better than I had expected it to be for fuel efficiency. So I'm quite impressed that it by itself was able to get us into orbit without having to cut into the second stage at all. So this probe is severely overbuilt. Now, because I know we're going to be cutting this stage out, we're going to burn early, then we're going to stage, because this stage has a significantly smaller thrust-to-weight ratio. But it won't be too much of a problem. Now we've already deployed the solar panels because I didn't want to run out of electric charge earlier. Now of course we're still focused on the moon, so we'll just let this actually go through. And I'm pretty sure you guys can tell what's going to go on is once we hit our periapsis, basically the second maneuver node is going to slow us down and cause us to re-angle ourselves. Now the closer you can get this to the actual inclination of the targeted orbit, of course the less delta V you'll have to do in part 2 of this burn. But that's all variable, like it can change. So it appears as though we might have overshot a little bit. Let's point prograde and change, because of course we don't actually have our periapsis marker here. And this thing really doesn't have any control. Probably would have been easier if I had put a reaction wheel on it. So there we go. We slowed down enough, and now our periapsis has returned. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep slowing down because I know this is the direction we have to focus on. And I'm just going to do so very slowly until, of course, we actually, since we overburned the node, we actually get what the node wanted us to have. So we're almost there, and this is what I mean. Just barely burning the engine causes so much to change on this periapsis. Which means because we're so far away, we have a massive influence on our moon's orbit while we're far away, meaning we also have a super high efficiency. There we go. I think that should be good enough. Of course, we can do fine tweaking later. It's a little overshot, but it'll do. So now what we want to do is we want to take the point that just crosses closest to the targeted orbit, which is just before the periapsis, as it turns out. And we're going to add another maneuver, since this is our actual flight path. And what this maneuver is going to say is it's going to tell us slow down and change your inclination. And then of course, because these two actually affect each other, we're just going to kind of increment them each slowly and individually. And now we're actually going to push radial in, because of course this is outlying a little bit. So by pushing radial in, it's going to basically push this in and then push the new orbit out. So we're going to kind of align it so that there's a middle ground, and then we'll just slow down more. And then we'll keep aligning it and slow down more until the apoapsis and periapsis are almost identical. Actually, we can make them identical, can't we? See, the predicted orbit still is a little bit high. Now, of course, this is just a decent bit of maneuver node tweaking. There, I think that looks pretty good. It's pretty spot on, not perfect, but hopefully it'll be good enough for the contract. If not, then of course we can do minor adjustments later, but it looks pretty solid. So all we have to do now is we're going to reorient our craft so that it's facing the correct orientation. And I just missed the maneuver node because I was scrolling through this. Okay, so I was right. The materials bay is the Science Junior. That's what I thought it was, because I think it had a different name when Science was new to Kerbal Space Program, but apparently I forgot. So we're just going to let our craft, our probe, coast into the moon's orbit so that we can actually make sure our second node is going to work for us. There we go, now we're at 30. Now we'll just let the last 10 seconds actually tick down, make sure our node is nice and aligned. And we'll wait until 20, 19 burn. And now we're slowing down our orbit and changing our plane. So what we should be doing is perfectly aligning ourselves with the targeted orbit. Because of course we went from Kerbin's orbit and we made sure our orientation was correct, and that we would encounter the targeted orbit with our flyby periapsis. So it looks like we actually reached the orbit that we need, so we'll call that good and maintain stability for 10 seconds. We'll give that a little bit, and there we go. We have completed our contract of launching a satellite in a specific orbit. Of course, for about 125,000 funds. And of course, this wasn't very difficult, and it wasn't very fuel costly. I don't even think we used half of this stage, did we? We used about half of our second stage of fuel. We didn't even cut into the last 1,800 that we had in this top stage. Simply because we were more efficient, meaning that a probe like this that you might have normally had to have launched to do this, because of course you'd have to get your encounter, then you'd have to do the plane change for 300 to 400 delta V. You can actually do it for significantly less, because I don't think we used much more than 100 delta V for that last node. I actually didn't look at it, but I'm sure it was much less than a normal plane change would have been, because we did most of our editing when we were still in Kerbin's orbit. That way we had more significant influence. So yeah, that's how you can actually fly from Kerbin's orbit into a targeted orbit over here. Now, you can actually do the same thing for encounters. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but I kind of want to make a mention of it, is if when you encounter another vessel, what happens is you put your flyby periapsis somewhere on that target orbit, and then all you do is you make sure that your plane is aligned, so you have the same inclination as the target, and then you slow down. And when you slow down, you always make it so that, let's actually bring this fancy thing out again. If, let's say you meet up here at this location, when you slow down, you only slow down to say not the exact orbit. You don't necessarily match it. Because if you don't match it, what this does is say that your target is at this location. What happens is they will do a full one, they'll go here, and then they'll do a full orbit, and since you'll be moving slower, you'll be able to encounter. But like I said, we'll talk about that when we actually do it, because I'm sure we're going to be creating an orbital station around the moon, or more importantly around Minmus, because we're actually going to be creating a mining base when we unlock the drills. Of course, to unlock the drills, we need to get more funds so that we can buy the upgrade to the Research and Development Center, which is why we've kind of been doing these silly little contracts. So to upgrade this thing, we need, I think it's 160,000. If I right-click it, I should be able to tell. Or if I right-click it, KSP should be able to crash. But aside from this weird bug that I've been getting, this is going to be the end of episode 12. I thank you guys for watching. This is PTT, GRW, signing out.